At dinner, my daughter-in-law smirked and said, "Let's be honest, this house isn't really yours anymore." She said it like I was already gone, like I didn't matter. In the house I spent 37 years building. After more than 30 years surviving wars she couldn't even imagine. My son said nothing. He just looked down at his plate. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I just watched, counted, and waited. Because what she didn't realize was that I had already seen everything. And in the next few weeks, everything she thought was hers would quietly disappear. Before we begin, I'm genuinely grateful you're here. Drop a comment and tell me what country or city are you watching from. I read every single one. This story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or places is coincidental, but the lesson it carries is worth your time. I've faced enemy fire in the South China Sea, survived storms that would have broken lesser ships, and carried the weight of burying men I loved like brothers. 30 years in the Navy will do that to you. It hardens you, prepares you for the worst. Or so I thought. Nothing in any of that prepared me for the look on my son's face the morning he pulled into my driveway. He had his wife with him, 3 suitcases in the trunk, and the expression of a man who had already lost and knew it. I was on the front porch when they arrived, coffee in hand, the way I've started every morning since Eleanor passed, just me and the quiet and the early light coming gold and thin through the oak trees on Randall Street. September in Annapolis has a particular quality to it. The heat hasn't broken yet, but something in the air has shifted like the season making up its mind. The brick on the front of the house caught the morning light the way it always did, warm, familiar, unchanged. I bought this house in 1987, Eleanor and I. 2 stories colonial, brick on a street old enough that the sidewalks buckle from tree roots nobody has the heart to cut. We raised David here. I've lived alone since March of 2019, when Eleanor left on a Tuesday morning, quietly and without drama, the way she did most things. The house has been mine since then in the way a house becomes yours after loss. Not just property, the physical outline of everything that mattered. I heard David's car before I saw it. That old Accord with the exhaust that needs fixing, the one I'd offered to pay for 3 times, and he'd declined 3 times. Net stubborn in the particular way sons are stubborn when they're trying to prove something to their fathers. The car turned into the driveway and stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved. Cynthia got out first. She didn't wait for David to come around. She stepped out and stood at the end of my driveway and looked at my house. Not the way a daughter-in-law looks at her father-in-law's home. The way an appraiser looks at a property before writing a number down. Her eyes moved from roofline to foundation. Systematic, unhurried, and paused at the garage with an almost imperceptible nod. Private and satisfied. The look of a woman confirming something she had already decided. David came around the car carrying 2 of the 3 suitcases. His shoulders had that particular set. To them, not tired, something worse than tired, collapsed inward. Like a man who'd spent a long time learning to make himself smaller. He was 41 years old and walking toward me like he was 12 and had broken something valuable. I shook his hand and pulled him in briefly the way we'd always done. He held on a half-second longer than usual. I noted that too. Cynthia's handshake was confident. Direct eye contact, 1 pump a fraction longer than necessary. Her smile landed exactly halfway between professional warmth and family affection. Engineered to precision. "Tom, thank you so much for having us." "Of course," I said, meaning none of it, intending to find out exactly what she meant. Inside, she moved through my house with the confidence of someone doing a walkthrough they had rehearsed. She found the guest room without asking, opened cabinet doors until she found what she needed. Within 20 minutes, she had her phone out photographing rooms. "Just documenting for insurance purposes," she said when she caught me watching. I nodded. People who document for insurance purposes don't photograph ceiling moldings. David unpacked. He moved with the practiced motions of a man following instructions received before arrival. Suitcase here, toiletries there. He answered my questions in complete sentences and volunteered nothing extra. Something had been methodically taken from him. I recognized the process. I had seen it in sailors who had been under a particular kind of command for too long. Dinner was Eleanor's table, Eleanor's dishes and food. Cynthia had brought herself in a cooler from the car, thoughtful on the surface, control underneath if she brought the food. She owned the menu. She owned the table. The conversation was comfortable, which is where dangerous conversations always live. Then somewhere between the salad and the main course, Cynthia set down her fork and said, "Tom, the house it's in your name, right? Just making sure for insurance purposes." She said it the way you'd ask about the weather. "Thomas Miller," I said. "Always has been." She nodded, once picked up her fork, and a few minutes later, I saw her take out her phone under the table. 2, maybe 3 seconds of typing. I knew exactly what she was checking. People in her profession verify quickly through SDAT, the Maryland State Department of Assessments and Taxation, a public database at sdat.dat.maryland.gov. Type in an address, get the owner of record assessed value, any active liens or mortgages. Fast and clean. The first stop for any real estate professional who wants a quick answer. What SDAT doesn't show is the deed itself. For that, you'd need mdlandrick.net, the Maryland State Archives land records system, where you search by county, pull the actual recorded instrument, and read every word of it. The document that says not just who owns a property, but how and what conditions attach to that ownership. SDAT showed Cynthia exactly what she was looking for. Thomas Miller, no liens, no active mortgage. The answer she'd expected before she typed the address. She found it. She stopped there. I watched the small relaxation in her shoulders as she put the phone away. The quiet satisfaction of a professional who has confirmed her assumptions. She was good at her work. She was not. It turned out thorough enough at it. By 9 o'clock, the house had settled into a quiet that felt different from the quiet I'd known for 5 years. Occupied. Waited. I went to the garage. The workshop was Eleanor's joke and my sanctuary. Workbench along the back wall, tool outlines and a permanent marker on the pegboard, so you know immediately when something's been moved. A half-finished side table sat in the middle of the floor. I'd been working on it since July, unhurried. I picked up a hand plane and made a few passes along the grain. Then I heard her voice through the drywall, muffled but unmistakable. Cynthia on the phone. The words weren't clear, just tone, and tone was enough. I know the difference between a conversation and a performance. What I was hearing was neither. It was something intimate in the specific way intimacy sounds when it's being hidden. Soft, low, with laughter that rose and fell in a register that had nothing to do with the man sleeping down the hall. I set down the hand plane and looked up at the photograph on the shelf above the workbench. Eleanor Summer of 2011, laughing at something off camera at the sailboat races, her hair caught sideways in the wind. "Eleanor," I said quietly, "we've got company, the wrong kind." I didn't know his name yet, but I knew there was another man, and I knew that man had something to do with why Cynthia had looked at my house the way a developer looks at an empty lot. What she didn't know, what I hadn't told anyone in years, was that this particular lot came with a legal layer she hadn't thought to look for. She'd checked SDAT and found what she expected. She'd never pulled the physical deed. And in 30 years of naval intelligence, I'd learned one thing above all others. The most dangerous information is always the information you don't know you're missing. 2 weeks. That's all it took for Cynthia to start rewriting the rules of my own house. Not all at once, she was too smart for that. She did it the way water works on stone, slowly, consistently, until one morning you look up and realize the landscape has changed and you can't quite remember when it happened or how you let it get that far. I noticed every step. That was the problem. I noticed and I said nothing. Because 30 years of naval intelligence taught me that the most dangerous thing you can do in a long campaign is show your hand before you're ready to play it. So I watched. I cataloged. I kept my face neutral and my coffee cup in my hand, and I stood at the edge of my own life like a man on watch, seeing everything, reporting to no one. By the last week of September, the maple out front had gone full red, and the mornings had that particular Annapolis chill that settles in off the Severn before the sun gets high enough to burn it off. The house smelled like someone else's coffee blend. The furniture in the living room had shifted not dramatically, just enough that the sight lines were different. The way a room feels after someone's quietly moved in. Which I suppose was exactly what had happened. That particular morning started like the others had started all week. I came downstairs at 6:15, the way I always do, and found David on his knees in the middle of the kitchen floor with a rag and a bucket of soapy water. He was scrubbing along the baseboards, the kind of cleaning that nobody asks for and nobody notices unless it isn't done. Cynthia sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and her phone. Scrolling with one thumb, her legs crossed her posture, the posture of a woman completely at ease in her own home. She didn't look up when I walked in. David did. Just briefly a quick glance over his shoulder, something in it I couldn't quite name. Not embarrassment exactly, something further along the road than embarrassment. The look of a man who has stopped expecting things to be different. I went to the counter and poured myself a coffee, sat down across from Cynthia, said good morning to the room in general. She returned it pleasantly, still looking at her phone. David said nothing and kept scrubbing. I sat there and I drank my coffee and I did not say a word. But inside, there was something tearing loose. Something I hadn't felt since the years when David was small and I was away at sea for months at a stretch, and I'd come home to find he'd grown in ways I'd missed and couldn't get back. There was a particular guilt in that, the guilt of absence. What I was feeling now was different, worse maybe, because I wasn't absent. I was sitting right there 3 feet away, watching my son scrub a floor. He didn't dirty in a house that wasn't his wife's to commandeer. I thought about the morning I came home from a 7-month deployment in the Western Pacific. David was 8. He had been waiting at the end of the pier with Eleanor. I could see him from the deck as we came in, this small figure in a red jacket jumping up and down. The moment the gangway touched the dock, he came running full speed, arms already out, yelling "Dad's home," loud enough that the sailors around me laughed. He hit me at a dead run and held on like he was afraid the ship would take me back. The man scrubbing the baseboards and the boy on that pier. I couldn't connect them. I kept trying and I couldn't. By afternoon, the chill had burned off. And Cynthia had 2 friends over colleagues from her office, both of them, the polished, sharp-edged kind that come with the territory of commercial real estate in a city like Annapolis. They took the living room. David brought out a tray of drinks he'd prepared without being asked, set it on the coffee table, and started to head back to the kitchen. "David!" Cynthia's voice pleasant light, the tone of someone correcting something minor. "The throw pillows, they're crooked." He stopped, turned back, went to the sofa and began straightening the decorative pillows one by one, while the 2 women watched with the particular expression that falls somewhere between pity and entertainment. The expression of people watching something they'd never allow in their own lives. I was sitting in the corner chair with a book I hadn't been reading for the past hour. My right hand found the arm of the chair and held it. I counted to 10 in my head. A technique I'd learned at 22 on the bridge of my first ship in weather that wanted to kill us when panic in the man giving orders means panic in everyone. You count. You breathe. You do not let what you're feeling into your face. 10, 15, 20. David finished with the pillows and went back to the kitchen without a word. The conversation at the sofa resumed as though nothing had happened, because for everyone in that room except me, nothing had. That night I went to the garage after the house went quiet. I stood in front of Eleanor's photograph for a long time without picking up any tools. The half-finished side table sat in the middle of the floor where I had left it, untouched since before they'd arrived. I hadn't been able to work on it. Some part of me felt irrationally that to continue it in the middle of all this would be wrong. Like carrying on a private conversation in a room that was no longer private. "Eleanor," I said finally, "I don't know how to fix this. The enemy isn't outside the wire this time. The enemy is sleeping in our son's bed." I pulled out the stool and sat down and opened the bottom drawer of the workbench, the one where Eleanor used to keep her recipe cards in a little wooden box she'd bought at a craft fair in Eastport. The box was still there. I moved it to one side and took out the small black notebook I'd put there 3 days ago. I opened it to the next blank page, wrote the date at the top. Then I started writing actions, times, exact words, the baseboards, the pillows, the tone of voice. Every detail I'd stored through the day the way I'd been trained to store them. Precise. unemotional on the page, even when it hadn't been unemotional in the room. I'd kept operational logs before, months-long campaigns in cramped quarters, diesel smell, and salt air recording, everything that might matter later. I knew how to do this. I just never had to do it in my own kitchen. I kept that black notebook in the same drawer where Eleanor used to keep her recipe cards. Every night before bed, I added to it names, dates, exact words. I'd filled 12 pages by the end of September. I was on page 23 when Cynthia made her first real mistake. I almost missed it. It came disguised as something as ordinary as a cup of coffee. There's a moment in every conflict when the other side makes their first real move. Not a probe, not a test. A deliberate strike calculated and committed. I'd been waiting for it. I just didn't expect it to come in a coffee cup. The mornings had developed a pattern by early October. Cynthia was always in the kitchen, first moving efficiently through the routine she'd established her coffee, then David's, then mine. In that order of priority which told you something. The sycamores along the Severn were shedding fast now, and the fog sat low over the water on the cold mornings. The kind of gray that gets into a house through the window glass. That particular morning, I came downstairs earlier than usual. I'd been a light sleeper since my Navy days. A ship at sea doesn't give you the luxury of sleeping through things. And something had pulled me awake before 5. I moved quietly down the stairs in socks the way I'd learned to move, in spaces where being heard changes the situation. Cynthia was at the counter with her back to the doorway. She didn't hear me come in. I watched her make the coffee. She filled 2 mugs, then reached behind the cereal box on the second shelf, not into it, behind it, and took out a small amber bottle. She tapped something from it into the mug nearest her right hand. Put the bottle back. Moved the cereal box flush against the wall. She turned around and saw me at the kitchen doorway. "Morning," she said pleasantly. "Just getting the coffee started." "Thanks," I said. I crossed the kitchen, took the mug she had prepared and carried it to the table. Sat down, picked it up with both hands the way I do every morning, feeling the warmth through my palms. Waited until she turned to the refrigerator. Then I leaned sideways and poured it into the potted plant on the windowsill, a spider plant Eleanor had propagated from a cutting years ago, the kind that survives everything. I straightened up and set the empty mug down and picked up the newspaper I'd left on the table the night before. By the time Cynthia turned back around, I was reading the sports section. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," I said, which was true. I spent that day performing a version of myself I'd never had to perform before. Slower on the stairs, slower answering questions, a pause before words that shouldn't require pausing over. After lunch, I sat in the armchair in front of the television and let my eyes go heavy, chin dropping twice in the way of a man losing the battle against an afternoon nap. Through my lashes, I watched Cynthia watching me from the kitchen doorway. She had a particular expression in those moments, not quite a smile, something more contained than that. The expression of a person observing a process going according to plan. David noticed the change in me too in his way. That evening he asked if I was feeling all right, and I told him I'd just been sleeping poorly. He accepted that. He had no reason not to. He didn't know what his wife was putting in my coffee, and I had no intention of telling him yet, not until I had more than a hidden bottle and my own observations to work with. That night through the ceiling of my bedroom, I heard Cynthia's voice. I couldn't make out words, but I recognized the pattern she was on the phone, the same low register I'd heard that first evening. Then a sentence came through clearly, the way sentences sometimes do, through old construction when everything else goes quiet. "It's working. He's getting worse. Give it another 2 weeks and we can start talking to the facility." The facility. I lay in the dark and let that word settle. I knew what it meant. I'd heard it used before in the particular context of aging parents and impatient relatives. It meant the memory care unit. It meant signatures on documents by someone deemed incompetent to sign them himself. I reached for the black notebook on the nightstand, wrote down the time, 10:47 p.m., and the exact words as close as I could reconstruct them. Then I put the notebook away and lay back and stared at the ceiling and thought about what I was going to do next. The following morning, the moment Cynthia's car backed out of the driveway, I went to the kitchen. The amber bottle was where she'd left it behind the cereal box. I took it out carefully, holding it at the base to preserve the surface, and carried it to the table. The label read, Zolpidem 10 milligrams. It's a prescription sedative, the kind doctors prescribe for severe insomnia. The kind that makes you slow and confused and compliant in the specific way that someone scheming to have you declared incompetent would find very useful. There was no prescription label, no patient name, nothing to connect it to anyone in this household legitimately. I photographed it from 3 angles with my phone label bottom full bottle. Then I took a clean Ziploc bag from the drawer, sealed the bottle inside it, and put it in my jacket pocket. From the cabinet under the sink, I found a vitamin C bottle, same amber plastic, close enough in size, and put it in the cereal box's shadow, where the Zolpidem had been. Same position, same orientation. For whoever was checking, nothing had changed. I called Bill Harrison from the garage with the door closed and the radio on low. Bill and I served together for 12 years. He was my intelligence officer for the last 8 of them, the kind of man who could pull a thread on anyone anywhere, and not leave fingerprints on the process. He'd retired 2 years before I did, and set up a private security consulting practice in Annapolis. We had coffee every few weeks. He was the only person on earth I trusted completely with something like this. Bill, I said, I need you to run a name and look into a sedative called Zolpidem, specifically any local purchase history connected to a man named Mark. No prescription in my name, so it didn't come from my doctor. And one more thing. I looked at the Ziploc bag on the workbench. I need you to bring me something that can listen, and something that can watch. Quietly. A short pause on his end. How quiet do you need it? The kind of quiet you and I used in the Gulf, I said. That kind? Bill had been my intelligence officer for 12 years. He knew exactly what that kind of quiet meant. What I didn't know yet was that while I'd been watching Cynthia, Bill had already started pulling threads on someone else, a man whose name I hadn't heard yet, but whose fingerprints were already all over the situation inside my house. Within 48 hours, he would hand me a photograph that put everything into focus. Middleton Tavern has been standing since 1750. George Washington drank here. So did I for 40 years. It was the kind of place where you could talk quietly and no one paid attention, which made it the perfect place for a briefing. Bill Harrison was already at the corner table when I walked in back to the wall, the way we both automatically positioned ourselves in any room. 2 beers on the table, neither touched. His laptop opened a manila folder beside it. He looked up when I came through the door and gave me the same nod he had given me across a dozen different briefing rooms over 12 years short. Precise. Meaning, sit down, we have work to do. Bill had called 2 days after our phone conversation to say he had already started pulling threads. That was Bill's way. You didn't ask him to begin. You called, and he was already in motion. 31 years in naval intelligence, the last decade of it running operations. I wasn't cleared to know the full details of. And now a small private security firm on Compromise Street that did exactly as much business as he wanted it to do, and not $1 more. I sat down across from him, and he pushed one of the beers toward me. Tell me what you have, he said. So I did. All of it, from the first morning on the porch to the amber bottle behind the cereal box, the overheard phone call, the vitamin C swap, every entry in the black notebook. Bill listened without interrupting, which was one of the things that made him good at his job. He let people finish. He took notes in the small, precise handwriting he had had since the Academy capital letters. No cursive, the kind of hand that doesn't leave room for misreading under pressure. When I finished, he opened the manila folder. The first page was a pharmacy printout. Zolpidem 10 milligrams, he said. Purchased 6 weeks ago at a drugstore on West Street, 3 blocks from your house. Paid with a Visa card registered to a Mark Calloway. He slid it across the table. No prescription on file, no physician authorization. Just a cash equivalent card transaction for a quantity that would last approximately 4 to 6 weeks at therapeutic dosage. I put the Ziploc bag on the table beside the printout. The label on the bottle matched the printout, exactly same dosage, same manufacturer. Bill looked at both items for a moment. Maryland Criminal Code Section 5-601, he said quietly. Obtaining a controlled dangerous substance without a valid prescription. That's a felony. Add the intent element administering it to another person without consent, and you're looking at something considerably more serious. He paused. How did you get the pharmacy record? I should mention for my own peace of mind that my source is a former DEA contact who runs license compliance audits for independent pharmacies in Anne Arundel County. Everything obtained through proper channels. I believe you, I said. You should. I'm not 25 anymore. I don't take risks I can't account for. He turned the laptop toward me. A photograph filled the screen. A man in his mid-40s, good-looking, in the way that requires maintenance, the kind of smile that gets doors opened. Standing outside what looked like a waterfront property in Eastport, one hand in his pocket, relaxed. Mark Calloway, Bill said. Independent real estate broker licensed in Maryland since 2018. Prior to that, a civil fraud judgment in Virginia misrepresenting property values to a private buyer. The judgment was settled confidentially, and the court record was later expunged. He tapped the side of the laptop. Expunged doesn't mean gone. It means you need to know where to look. He pulled up the next screen, the Anne Arundel County Inspections and Permits portal, the public database maintained at the county website, accessible to anyone with an internet connection. 2 weeks before Cynthia moved into your house, Bill said, Mark Calloway submitted a commercial development permit application for your address on Randall Street. Permit type and mixed-use commercial conversion. Status as of this morning, pending awaiting ownership verification. I looked at the application on the screen. The submission date was clear. So was the address. He filed this before she even moved in, I said. 11 days before. Bill closed the laptop. Which means the Zolpidem, the permits, the timing of their arrival at your house, none of it was improvised. This was a coordinated operation, Tom. Not a family and temporary hardship. A planned acquisition. The bar moved quietly around us. Someone fed the jukebox near the door. I picked up the beer and drank half of it and set it down. Bill reached into the bag at his feet and placed a small box on the table between us. Inside was what appeared to be a standard hearing aid, the kind a man my age might reasonably start wearing, and a second object the size of a thick pen cap. And the hearing aid amplifies, he said. Motion activated above normal conversation volume. It doesn't record. Maryland doesn't allow that without consent. And I'm not going to hand anyone a felony to use against us. What you hear, you remember. What you remember, you write in that notebook. Your handwriting is your evidence, not a file, not a timestamp. Your word backed by a documented pattern. He held up the second object. This is a camera housing. Wide-angle lens, motion-triggered, completely passive, no Wi-Fi signal. Records locally to internal storage. I'll need access to your garage to mount it properly. Maryland is two-party consent, I said. I know the law, Commander. He said it without edge, just stating a fact. Which is exactly why none of this goes near a courtroom. What it goes near is the compliance department of whatever firm Cynthia works for, the Maryland Real Estate Commission. And the 3 private investors Mark Calloway has been soliciting for this development project. He leaned back. What scares a licensed real estate director more than a criminal charge? I looked at him. Losing her license, I said. Losing her license? He agreed. Publicly, permanently, before she ever sees the inside of a courtroom. He had one more thing in the folder. Mark Calloway carried debt across 6 different accounts. 2 personal loans, a business line of credit, and 3 credit cards. Total outstanding $220,000. Minimum payments and arrears on 4 of the 6. The development project, if it cleared, permitting and transferred ownership, would generate enough commission and resale value to clear everything. He's not just using her, Bill said. He's drowning, and she's the life preserver. The interesting part is, she has no idea. She thinks she's the one running this. I looked out the window toward the harbor. The water was going silver in the early evening light the way it does in October, when the sun drops fast. She's not just the predator in this story, Bill, I said. She's also the prey. Does that change anything? I thought about it honestly. No, I said, but it changes the sequence. I drove home that evening with a hearing aid in my jacket pocket, a permit application in my bag, and a pharmacy record that connected Mark Calloway to a controlled substance purchased without a prescription. But there was still something I needed. I needed to understand exactly how far Cynthia had already gone, and I had a feeling she was about to start showing me. Up close, in my own living room. In the Navy, we had a saying: the enemy reveals themselves most completely when they believe they're safe. Cynthia believed she was safe. She'd spent 2 weeks watching me shuffle around my own house, glassy-eyed and slow. She thought she understood the battlefield. She didn't. By the last Friday of October, the oaks on Randall Street had gone fully copper, and the evenings came early and cold. Cynthia had been planning the dinner party for a week. I knew this because she'd had David rearrange the living room furniture twice and polish the silverware on a Tuesday night, which is not something people do for casual company. She told me it was colleagues, business contacts, nothing I needed to worry about. I put on my hearing aid that afternoon and settled into the armchair by the front window with a book I had no intention of reading. The guests arrived at 7. 3 of them, 2 women from Cynthia's office whose names I caught once and wasn't meant to remember, and a man who came last. Shook hands with Cynthia at the door in the particular way of people who have shaken hands many times before and are performing the formality for an audience. Mark Calloway. I recognized him from Bill's photograph immediately, the maintained good looks, the ease of a man comfortable in other people's spaces. He was wearing a sport coat that cost more than the monthly payment on a car, and he moved through my front door with the unhurried confidence of someone who had already decided he belonged there. David was in the kitchen. He had been cooking since 4. I kept my eyes soft and my head slightly forward, the posture of a man losing a quiet battle against fatigue. It wasn't difficult to maintain. I'd spent 2 weeks practicing it. Cynthia made the introductions in the living room. She moved through the space with the ownership of someone who'd redecorated it herself, which she had incrementally over 6 weeks, into new throw pillows. Eleanor's reading lamp relocated to the corner, the family photographs on the mantel reduced by half. When she got to me, she didn't cross the room. She gestured from where she was standing. "That's my father-in-law, Tom. Don't mind him, he has good days and bad days." She said it lightly, the way you'd mention a piece of furniture that was occasionally inconvenient. The 2 women glanced at me with the brief, polite discomfort of people who don't know what to do with that information. Mark Calloway looked at me for exactly 2 seconds, assessing, concluding. Moving on. I blinked slowly and turned back to the television. On the screen, a weather anchor was gesturing at a map of the Mid-Atlantic. I watched it with the focused attention of a man for whom this was the most interesting thing happening in the room. The hearing aid brought their voices in, clearly enough to follow. I didn't record a word of it. I didn't need to. I had a notebook in my pocket and 30 years of training that said, write it down, exactly write it down immediately and sign it with the date. Mark positioned himself near the fireplace, the natural center of the room, the place a man stands when he wants to be listened to without appearing to demand it. He had a drink in one hand and he talked about the waterfront market in Annapolis, about the way mixed-use development was changing the character of the historic districts, about opportunities that people with vision could see that others couldn't. The Randall Street corridor specifically, he said, has significant untapped potential. The bones are there. The location is there. It's just a matter of the right development vision being applied to the right property. He said the property, not Tom's house, not this street, this neighborhood, this place where a family had lived for 37 years. The property. The word of a man who had already converted the thing in his mind from a home to a transaction. I turned a page of my book. David came out twice with food, a tray of appetizers first, then a second trip with the wine. He moved quietly the way he'd learned to move in this house over the past 6 weeks, setting things down carefully and stepping back without drawing attention to himself. Mark didn't look at him either time. Not a glance. Not a nod, the complete non-acknowledgement of a person who has decided that some people in a room don't require recognition. The second time David came through, Cynthia stopped him mid-step. The glasses need to be on the left side of the plates, not the right. Conversational, pleasantly corrective. Could you fix that before you go back? David set down the wine, went to the table, moved 4 glasses from right to left, picked up the wine again, and went back to the kitchen. He didn't say anything. The 2 women from Cynthia's office watched with the careful expressions of people deciding whether they had seen what they thought they'd seen. I turned another page. Inside, something that had been tightening for 6 weeks pulled another notch. The man who had carried 2 suitcases up my front steps and held on a half-second too long when I hugged him, who had once run a pier at full speed in a red jacket. With his arms already out, that man was now rearranging glassware in his father's kitchen, so his wife's colleagues wouldn't have to see anything unpleasant. I counted. Not to 10 this time, further. The guests left around 10. I stayed in the armchair with the television on, low eyes half closed, performing the last act of the evening, an old man who drifted off and wasn't worth disturbing. David ran water in the kitchen. Through the half-open door to the back hallway, I could hear Cynthia and Mark on the covered back porch, their voices dropping the way voices drop when a house still has people in it, but those people are assumed not to matter. The hearing aid brought it in clear. Cynthia. It's working. He's getting worse faster than I thought. Maybe another month. A pause. Mark. The permits are pending. The moment the title transfers, we break ground. I've already briefed the investors. I sat very still. The permits are pending. Not planning to file. Not considering options. Pending meaning filed entered into the county system. Waiting only for the ownership verification that would never resolve in the way they expected. And investors had been briefed, which meant money had been promised. Which meant the timeline wasn't theoretical. It was operational. I waited until I heard the back door open and close. Then I took out the black notebook. 10:24 p.m. Exact words. Both voices. The specific phrasing the moment the title transfers we break ground. I wrote it the way I'd been trained to write field notes. No interpretation. No commentary. Just the record. I went to bed that night with 6 pages of handwritten notes, exact words, exact times, exact sequence on a device that required no battery and left no digital trail. A notebook. The most reliable intelligence tool I had ever used, and 1 sentence on a loop in my head. I've already briefed the investors. That meant money had moved. Real money. And real money always leaves a trail, which meant that when Bill pulled Mark Calloway's financial records, he was going to find something that would change not just my strategy, but my understanding of exactly what was happening inside my own house. There are conversations a father postpones too long, not because he doesn't know what to say, but because he's afraid of what he'll hear back. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, I saw the light under the garage door come on, and I knew my son couldn't sleep either. I was at the workbench when he came in, making slow passes along the side table I'd been working on since July. The wood was almost ready another few sessions, and I'd be at the finishing stage. I heard the door open behind me, and I didn't turn around. I just kept working. David sat down on the old 3-legged stool in the corner, the one that had been there since before he was born, the one he used to sit on as a boy and watch me work. He didn't say anything for a while. Neither did I. The hand plane moved. The wood gave. Outside, the November wind moved through the oaks. Then he said, "Dad, I know you're not losing it." I set the plane down on the bench, turned around. "How long have you known?" "Since the 2nd week." I pulled over the second stool and sat down across from him. He was looking at the floor, elbows on his knees, hands loose. He looked like a man carrying something very heavy who had finally found a place to set it down. "Then talk," I said. He talked for a long time. He told me about the early years of the marriage, how Cynthia's certainty had felt like strength. At first, the way she moved through the world, without hesitation, always knowing what she wanted, always knowing the right room to be in. He'd mistaken that for confidence. It took him years to understand the difference between a person who is confident and a person who requires everyone around them to be smaller. He told me about the job loss, not just the layoff itself, the company acquisition, the restructuring his entire department eliminated in a single afternoon, but what came after. How Cynthia had handled it, not with cruelty exactly, not at first, with a quiet, patient repositioning. She paid the rent, so she decided where they lived. She managed the accounts, so she decided what they spent. She made the plans, so he followed them. Each step had seemed reasonable in isolation. Together they had built something he hadn't noticed until he was already inside it. I kept waiting to feel like myself again, he said. I kept thinking next month, after the next thing, once I had a new job, once we got settled somewhere. He shook his head slowly. But I don't know who that is anymore, the person I was waiting to feel like. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I'd learned a long time ago that some things need to be said all the way to the end before they can be answered. When he finished, I stood up and put my hand on his shoulder. Do you remember what I taught you about navigation? I said. When you're lost at sea, you find one fixed point, something that doesn't move, and you sail toward it. He was quiet for a moment. What's the fixed point, Dad? You are, I said. You've always been there. She just made you forget. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. I watched something shift in his face, not relief, not yet. More like the first breath after a long time underwater. I went to the bench and opened the lower drawer past Eleanor's recipe box, past the black notebook, and took out a manila envelope I'd put there 3 weeks ago. I need to tell you some things, I said, and I need you to listen carefully because some of this is going to sound like I've been keeping it from you. I have, for reasons that I'll explain. I told him about the life estate deed, the document Eleanor and I had signed in 1987 and recorded at the Anne Arundel County Courthouse, the one that established the remainder interest in this property in favor of the Veterans Association of Maryland. I explained the difference between what the SDAT database showed my name, clean and simple, and what the physical deed at the courthouse actually said. I told him that Cynthia had looked at the SDAT record and stopped there satisfied, the way people stop looking when they find the answer they expected. He read the deed twice. Then he looked up. She doesn't know about this. No, and there's something else. I sat down again. I've been in contact with a lawyer named Patricia Owens. She's been practicing elder law and family litigation in Annapolis for 22 years. She's the person you call when the situation is exactly this complicated. She's already reviewed everything I've given her. I paused. Patricia wants you to do something, not for me, for yourself. I explained it carefully. Under Maryland law, the funds in a joint bank account belong equally to both account holders. David had the right to withdraw up to 50% of the current balance without Cynthia's authorization. That was his money legally and unambiguously. Additionally, any expenses he had paid on my behalf over the past months, medical costs, groceries, household supplies could be documented with receipts and reclaimed from the joint account as legitimate reimbursement. Patricia wants to meet with you tomorrow morning, I said. Before Cynthia's up. Her office is on State Circle. David didn't hesitate. I'll be there. We sat quietly for a moment. Then he said something I hadn't expected. Dad. His voice was lower but steadier than it had been all night. When the time comes, I want to be the one who opens the trap, not just watches it spring. I looked at him for a long moment. He meant it. I could see that, clearly not bravado, not impulse. Something more deliberate than either. The look of a man making a decision about who he intended to be. I nodded. Then we need to talk about the garage, I said, and about her phone. We talked until 2 a.m. When David finally went back inside, he walked differently just slightly, just enough that I noticed. A man beginning to remember how to stand up straight. What I hadn't told him yet was the full scope of what I was planning. Some operations succeed precisely because not everyone knows the entire mission. But David now knew his part, and he was ready to play it. Every great deception needs bait. The bait has to be believable, something the target wants badly enough that greed overrules judgment. After 6 weeks of watching Cynthia, I knew exactly what she wanted, and I knew exactly how to make her think she'd found it herself. Bill arrived at 1 p.m, right on time, driving his old gray pickup that looked more like a plumber's truck than the vehicle of a former Navy intelligence officer. That was always the thing about Bill Harrison. He understood that invisibility wasn't about disappearing. It was about looking ordinary enough that nobody bothered to look twice. He walked into the wood shop with a black equipment bag, and a carry-out coffee nodded at me, the way men do when words would just slow things down. She inside? He asked, voice low. "Our living room, on the phone," I said. "David's upstairs." "Good." He set the bag down, pulled the zipper, and got to work. We had been building the trap for 2 days starting Friday evening, while Cynthia was out at dinner with colleagues. I had already moved a metal lockbox down to the basement of the wood shop. It was the kind of document box you'd find in an old law office or a family estate, heavy, serious looking, with a combination lock that had some wear on the dial. There was nothing inside worth a second glance. A few old technical manuals and a blank legal pad. But the box looked important, and in this business appearance is architecture. The first layer had gone in Friday night. I staged the phone call from my desk in the wood shop, with the interior door to the kitchen left open just enough. Bill played the attorney. He's done it before. Clean voice, measured cadence. The kind of tone that makes you believe the man on the other end has a mahogany desk and a wall of diplomas behind him. "I just want to confirm," I said into the phone loud enough to carry, "that whatever my father left in the basement doesn't get folded into the estate valuation. Some of those items were transferred to me personally, not through the will." Bill on the other end, "That's correct, Mr. Miller. Personal property transferred outside the estate instrument wouldn't be subject to probate. I'd recommend keeping that documentation separate." I thanked him, said I'd bring the paperwork by, and ended the call. Cynthia had been in the kitchen refilling her coffee. I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. The second layer was already on my desk. It was an old homeowner's insurance rider, real not fabricated, that I had pulled from the filing cabinet and left open near the edge of the desk. The relevant line was visible without squinting. Personal property of significant value stored at residential address. I had placed it there Thursday evening. By Saturday afternoon, I had seen Cynthia pause at my desk twice under the pretense of looking for a pen. The document hadn't moved, but her eyes had. 3 separate signals, each planted at a different time. The phone call, the insurance rider on the desk, and David's question about the basement delivered so naturally that even I, who had scripted it, almost believed it was accidental. Each one on its own might mean nothing. Together, to someone in commercial real estate, who spent her days reading between the lines of property disclosures, they formed a picture that was almost impossible to ignore. The third layer was David. That was the part I hadn't been entirely sure about until he delivered it. Saturday afternoon, around 3 o'clock, David came into the wood shop while Cynthia was in the adjoining hallway. He didn't rush it. He didn't perform it. He just leaned against the doorframe the way he used to when he was a teenager, coming to ask if he could borrow the car, and said, "Dad, is the stuff Grandpa left in the basement still down there?" I looked up from the workbench. "Don't touch anything down there, David. Some things need to stay exactly where they are." He nodded, said, "Okay," and walked away. Cynthia was at the end of the hallway. She said nothing, but I caught it half a second, no more, her eyes moving toward the garage door before she turned back toward the kitchen. That was enough. I hadn't expected David to carry that so cleanly. The military bearing I had noticed returning in recent weeks wasn't performance. It was his baseline reasserting itself after years of being compressed. He was finding his footing again, one calculated step at a time. He had his mother's quality in that regard. Once Eleanor made up her mind about something, she didn't waver, didn't oversell it, didn't second-guess the delivery halfway through. She just did it and trusted the other person to receive it. Apparently so did he. Bill finished the equipment installation by 4:30. The camera was not a consumer device. It was a long-range surveillance lens housed inside a weatherproof gray casing. Mounted flush against a high branch of the oak tree at the back corner of the property, angled down across the rear yard and the garage entrance. From the ground in any light condition, it was invisible. Bill had used similar setups overseas during his active years. "Old school," he said, brushing bark dust off his sleeve. "Better than any drone. Drones have battery limits. This doesn't." The deadbolt was installed on the basement door, a timer-activated unit that engaged automatically at a preset time with no remote trigger required. I set it for 3 o'clock the following afternoon. Before we left the woodshop that evening, I confirmed the setting once more, and we both stepped back. "Once we leave, we don't touch it, Bill. The lock does what it does at the time we set. We're not in the loop after that." He agreed without argument. That was the point. No active control, no remote activation. The mechanism would engage whether we were home or 3 counties away. Clean legal and entirely passive. That night I went to bed at 9:15 early enough to be conspicuous. The house settled into quiet by 10. Bill's camera began its work. At 11:03, the footage showed Cynthia crossing the backyard with a small flashlight moving toward the woodshop entrance. She tried the main door unlocked, as I had left it, and stepped inside. She swept the flashlight across the workbench, past the shelving, and found the basement door. She pulled the handle. It held. She tried twice more, then stood still for a moment in the dark and left the way she came. Bill sent me the clip at 11:45. I called him back. She took the bait, I said. Yes, hook, line, and sinker, Commander. Image is crystal clear. And David, Obesinder. Ready, I said. He knows what to do with her phone. I gave her 3 days. 3 days for impatience to outrun caution. Something I had learned about human nature long before I ever learned it about an enemy on a battlefield. On the 3rd day, I told David it was time. He didn't hesitate, not for a single second. I told David we were going to the hardware store. We drove to the end of the block, pulled behind the oak tree in the neighbor's yard, and waited. Bill was already in position, not with a drone, but with a laptop connected to the camera he had mounted in the oak 3 days earlier. David sat in the passenger seat very still. He had done his part of this, and he had done it well. What he had done was simple and precise. That morning before we left, he had picked up Cynthia's phone from the kitchen counter with the kind of casual ease that only a husband could get away with the gesture of someone checking for missed calls on her behalf. In the space of about 4 seconds, he removed the battery and replaced it with a dummy of identical size and weight. Cynthia was in the shower. She never noticed. By the time she came downstairs and slipped the phone into her pocket, it was already dead without showing it. That was the piece I had been least certain about. Not the lock, not the camera, not the staged phone call, David, specifically. Whether he could hold himself together in the same room as Cynthia and do what needed to be done without giving any of it away, he had. Whatever had been compressed in him over the past few years, it hadn't touched the part of him that could move quietly under pressure. I recognized that quality. I had relied on it in other men, in other circumstances a long time ago. We sat in the car. Bill had the laptop open between us on the center console, the camera feed running live. The image was sharp rear yard garage entrance. The basement door just visible through the wood shop window at the right angle. At 2:43 in the afternoon they appeared. Cynthia came through the back gate first, moving with the deliberate calm of someone who had thought this through. Mark was 2 steps behind her, carrying a small canvas bag. Even on the grainy feed I could see the shape of it. The kind of bag a locksmith carries or a man who has picked a few locks before and doesn't advertise the fact. They crossed the yard, entered the woodshop, and disappeared from the exterior frame. Bill switched to the interior feed. They moved through the shop without touching anything on the workbench, which told me Cynthia had briefed him on the layout. Mark crouched at the basement door, worked the lock in under 90 seconds, and they descended. We watched them move through the basement on the lower camera, pulling open shelving, checking behind the water heater, lifting the tarp in the corner. Mark found the lockbox and set it on the floor. He was working on the combination when the timestamp on the feed read 3 p.m. The deadbolt engaged. There was no sound on the feed, but I saw the exact moment they realized it. Mark tried the door first, rattling it twice. Then Cynthia. Then Mark pulled out his phone, looked at the screen, held it up in different directions. No signal. Cynthia reached into her pocket. Her expression changed in a way I had not seen before. Not anger, not calculation, just the flat, stripped look of someone who has run out of moves and knows it. She tried the door again. Mark tried it again. They knocked. Nobody heard because there was nobody in the house. Bill made the call to Anne Arundel County Police at 3:08. Quiet. Concerned report from a neighbor who had seen 2 individuals enter the garage of a residence on Randall Street, while the homeowner appeared to be away. He gave them the address and hung up. 12 minutes later, a patrol unit rolled onto the block. David and I pulled in from the opposite direction at 3:22. Just as the second officer was stepping out of the cruiser, I parked, got out, and stood on the sidewalk with the unhurried expression of a man who had come home from the hardware store to find police at his door. Not alarmed, not unsurprised, just present. The officers located Cynthia and Mark through the deadbolt panel override and brought them up from the basement. Cynthia emerged first, and I will give her this. She recovered faster than most people would have. By the time she reached the yard, she had her face arranged and her story ready. "Officer, I'm so sorry for the confusion," she said. "I'm his daughter-in-law. Tom has been having some memory issues. We were trying to find his insurance documents. He sometimes forgets where he puts things." She placed one hand on her sternum as she said it, which was a nice touch. The gesture of a worried family member, not an intruder. Mark stood slightly behind her cooperative jacket, straight, saying nothing unless directly addressed. He was good at this. I noted that. The officer looked at me. I looked back at him with the patient, slightly tired expression of a man who has dealt with family complications before and is too old to make a scene about them. I said nothing. David beside me also said nothing. That had been the plan. Silence was not admission. Silence was simply a man who preferred to let the situation resolve itself without escalating. The officer wrote in his notebook, "Family dispute. No criminal charges at this time." They left. When the cruiser turned off Randall Street, Cynthia looked at me. Just for a moment. It was a small smile, the smile of someone who believes they have just won a hand and intends to remember it. I looked back at her without expression. David stood at my shoulder. Eyes level, not looking at the ground. That was new. That was different from the man who had arrived in September with slumped shoulders and nowhere to put his hands. Cynthia went inside. Mark followed. Bill appeared from the side of the house and stopped beside me. He kept his voice low. "She thinks she won that one," he said. "Good," I said. "Let her. It'll make her careless." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Tom, about Mark's financials. You need to sit down for this." What Bill had found wasn't merely interesting. It reshaped everything I thought I had understood about the arrangement between Cynthia and Mark. Because it turned out that while Cynthia had been busy working out how to take my house, someone had been quietly taking from her, and it had been going on for more than a year. Bill and I didn't speak until we were sitting across from each other at Middleton, 2 cold beers on the table between us, neither touched. There is information too important to deliver over a phone. You need to be looking directly at a person's face when they tell you something like this. The tavern was quiet on a Tuesday evening in mid-November. A few regulars at the bar, a couple near the fireplace. The low sound of a television in the back room, carrying a game nobody at our table cared about. Bill had chosen a corner booth, back wall sight lines to both doors. Old habits. He set a manila folder on the table between us. Without opening it, took a long drink from his glass and began. Mark Calloway had been managing a joint investment account with Cynthia for the past 18 months. That part I already knew in outline. Bill had mentioned it at our previous meeting as a thread worth pulling. What I had not known was how far that thread went, or where it led. Cynthia had transferred $340,000 into an account she believed was structured around a commercial real estate development project in Anne Arundel County. Construction permits pending, investors briefed, returns projected. The language in the investment summary Mark had given her was professional enough to pass a quick read, the kind of document that looks like due diligence until someone who knows what they're looking for actually runs the numbers. Bill opened the folder and laid a set of bank statements on the table. He had organized them chronologically, each page flagged with a yellow tab. I looked at the figures for a long moment without speaking. The development project did not exist. Mark had been using Cynthia's transfers to service gambling debts, 2 accounts, one in his name, one structured through a shell, LLC, registered in Delaware. The remainder had been routed to support a second residence in Baltimore, occupied by a woman whose name appeared 3 times in the statements as a shared utility account holder. The money had moved in consistent intervals, always within 48 hours of Cynthia's deposits, always in amounts just below the federal reporting threshold. She doesn't know," I said. "Not yet," Bill said. I picked up my glass, held it without drinking. Outside. The wind off the Severn was pushing hard enough that I could hear it against the tavern's old window frames, that particular sound of November on the waterfront, low and persistent. the kind that gets into the spaces between things. She never saw it coming from both directions at once. The woman running the scheme had her own scheme running against her. She was the hunter and the hunted, and she didn't know either one. He looked at me steadily. Does that change anything? I thought about it. Genuinely thought about it the way you have to when the answer matters. No, I said, but it changes the order. What I meant was, this Cynthia had set a plan in motion against my house, my name, and my son's future. That did not become less true because someone was running the same play against her from the other side. It meant the timeline had a natural pressure point. I hadn't anticipated a moment when her outside leverage would collapse on its own, and she would find herself exposed from two directions simultaneously. My job was to make sure that moment arrived at exactly the right time. Bill understood, without needing it, explained. He reached into the folder and produced a second document, a draft outline in Patricia Owen's handwriting, which told me the two of them had already spoken. The strategy was not the courtroom, it was the compliance office. Patricia would prepare a cover letter, addressed simultaneously to the compliance division of Cynthia's employer, the Maryland Real Estate Commission, and 3 of Mark's named investors. The letter would not submit the recordings as evidence. It would direct auditors to specific account numbers and transaction dates. Everything those auditors found from that point forward, they would find independently through their own institutional process, carrying their own authority, untouched by anything that could be challenged as improper collection. The instant Bill said, "What frightens people more than prison?" Espasters. I looked at him. "Losing everything they built." He nodded once. "Exactly. We agreed on the timing Patricia would send the compliance tip the morning after the dinner party, not before. Cynthia needed to be at full extension, committed, visible, invested before the ground shifted under her. Near the end of the second glass, Bill set his drink down and looked at the table for a moment before he spoke again. There was a different quality to the pause, not tactical, something older. "Tom, you know why I'm doing this," he said. "And it's not only because you were my commander." He stopped. I waited. "My father. His last years as second wife did something similar. Not the house, the accounts. By the time we figured it out, there was nothing left to find. I was in the Pacific, and I didn't know until it was too late to do anything except watch him sign papers he didn't understand." He looked up. "I got back stateside 3 weeks after the funeral. The accounts were closed. The woman was gone. And the lawyers told us there was no legal basis for recovery because he had signed everything voluntarily." The fireplace across the room put out a low, steady warmth. I looked at Bill, at the face of a man I had known for 12 years, and thought I had understood, realizing I had only known the operational version of him, the one that showed up with equipment bags and clean intelligence and dry humor. "I'm sorry, Bill," I said. He shook his head. "Don't be sorry, just win." We finished the second round and sketched 4 steps on a cocktail napkin, the way we used to plan in cramped briefing rooms that smelled of diesel and salt water. 4 steps. Exact sequence. No deviation. The 4th step, the one that ended everything, required a stage, and Cynthia, without knowing it, was about to build it for us. We paid the tab and walked out into the cold Annapolis night. At the corner of the block, Bill stopped. "Tom, she's about to throw a dinner party." I looked at him. "How do you know?" He smiled the way he used to smile before a successful operation, the expression of a man who has already read the last page. "Because people like her always do. When they think they're winning, they perform." 3 days later, Cynthia sent out invitations, and when Patricia called me about the guest list, I finally understood why she had been smiling for 2 weeks. Bill gave me a portable hard drive with 41 video files on it, exterior footage from the cameras mounted on my property, 3 weeks of time-stamped visual records. No audio. Maryland law is clear on that, and Patricia had been clear with us from the beginning. Nothing that could be challenged, nothing that handed them a weapon to use against us. What the camera showed was movement timing and pattern. It was enough. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, put on the headphones, and started from the beginning. I told myself I was reviewing evidence. What I was actually doing, something I didn't admit until 3 hours in, was sitting alone in a cold garage watching a woman move through my house like she already owned it. Time-stamped and documented while I read the notes I had written each night in the black notebook beside my bed. The woodshop was dark except for the laptop screen. Outside, the November wind had dropped to something quieter, the kind of stillness that settles over Annapolis after midnight, when the last of the bars have closed and the waterfront empties out. I had a blanket across my knees. Eleanor's old reading lamp, the one with the brass base, sat on the corner of the workbench where I had moved it years ago and never moved back. I turned it on. Then I pressed play. The first few files were administrative Cynthia on the phone with her office scheduling calls, reviewing contracts. Professional, clipped efficient, nothing unexpected. I made notes out of habit, logging timestamps and names the way I had been trained to treat raw intelligence without assumption, without conclusion, until the pattern emerged on its own. The pattern emerged on File 9. It was a call with Mark placed on a Tuesday afternoon 3 weeks earlier. Cynthia's voice carried the particular ease of someone who believes they are entirely unobserved, relaxed in a way she never was in any room I occupied. She was discussing timeline. Specifically, the timeline for what she referred to as the transition. Mark asked how long she thought it would take. Cynthia said 4 months, possibly 3 if things move faster than expected. She mentioned the SDAT record. She mentioned that the deed had never been pulled. She said, and I wrote this down, word for word, the old man doesn't understand what he's sitting on, and even if he did, there's nothing he could do about it at this point. I stopped the file, took a drink, started it again. File 14 was worse. It was a call to a facility I recognized the category from the opening exchange, the careful language of an intake coordinator explaining services. Cynthia had called to ask about the process for admitting an elderly family member who was showing, as she put it, early signs of cognitive decline. She asked about timelines, about legal guardianship protocols, about what documentation would be required if the individual in question was not yet formally diagnosed, but the family had concerns. The coordinator was professional and thorough. Cynthia thanked her warmly and said she would be in touch. I had suspected this. Knowing it and hearing it are different things. File 19 was a call with an attorney, whose name I didn't recognize. I noted it for Patricia. The subject was property transfer in cases where the owner had been deemed to lack legal capacity. Cynthia asked specific questions about the process, about court timelines, about whether a family member could initiate proceedings without the individual's cooperation. The attorney answered carefully, citing Maryland statute, explaining the evidentiary threshold for incapacity determinations. Cynthia listened without interrupting. At the end, she said, "That's helpful. I just want to make sure we do this correctly." 3 files later, Sandra worked in the accounting division of Cynthia's firm. I had not known her name before tonight. Over 3 separate calls, she and Cynthia discussed the movement of $87,000 in commission income that did not appear in the firm's standard reporting structure. The language was careful transactional, the vocabulary of 2 people who had spoken about money in this way before. I listened to all 3 calls twice. Then I noted Sandra's full name, the dates, and the specific account references Cynthia had used. That would go to Patricia separately, but it was not the legal material that stopped me. It was David. Across 41 files, my son's name appeared 19 times. I counted. Not once, not in a single instance, was he referred to as a person with agency or judgment, or a perspective that required consideration. He was a variable, a logistical factor. David won't push back. David's easier than I thought. And once, in a call with Mark that I had to replay twice because I wasn't certain I had heard it correctly, in a tone that carried something close to contempt. He's useful. I sat with that for a long time. I am not a man who cries easily. The Navy does not produce them, and 64 years of living does not either. But there was something in the accumulation of those 19 references, the complete absence of my son as a human being in any conversation his wife had conducted over 3 weeks, that hit a register I hadn't expected. I wasn't angry. I had moved past the territory of anger sometime around file 22. What I felt was something older and heavier. I felt it for David, not for myself. The last file was 41. Cynthia's voice late at night, the background sound suggesting she was in a car. Mark on the other end. She said, "Once the old man is in a facility, David won't have the backbone to fight back. He never has." I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a while. I don't know exactly how long. Long enough for the bourbon to go warm. Long enough for the brass lamp to feel like the only thing in the room that hadn't changed since Eleanor put it there. I thought about David on the stool in this same shop weeks ago in the early hours of the morning. Dad, I want to be the one who opens the trap. He had not hesitated when I told him it was time. Not for a single second. Cynthia was wrong about my son. She had been wrong from the beginning. I opened the laptop and wrote to Patricia Owens. Short, direct Patricia. "I have everything. I'm ready to move. Please schedule a meeting for the morning after the dinner party." Her reply came within the hour. She had been waiting. "Tom, I have an idea about the dinner party. Don't move yet. Let her build the stage first. And there's something about the guest list you need to hear." Then she told me what she had found. And I understood finally why she had been smiling for 2 weeks. Patricia Owens had been practicing elder law and family litigation in Annapolis for 22 years. She was the kind of attorney who spoke slowly, but thought fast, the most dangerous combination in any courtroom. When I laid the black notebook, the portable hard drive, the pharmacy record, the permit application, and the prenuptial agreement on her desk, that morning, she read through everything twice before she said a single word. Her office was on the second floor of a federal-style building, half a block from State Circle, the kind of space that accumulates authority quietly. Through shelves of case binders and frame bar admissions and a view of the Maryland State House dome that reminded you without being obvious about it, exactly where you were and what the law meant here. David sat to my left. Patricia sat across from us, reading. The room was very quiet except for the sound of pages turning and the occasional scratch of her pen making a note in the margin. She finished the prenuptial agreement last, set it down, looked up. "The adultery clause runs both directions," she said. "It does," I confirmed. "And you have documentation of the conduct." I placed a second USB drive on the desk. Bill's work photographs, time-stamped location data records of the Baltimore resident's utility account, cross-references. Patricia took the drive without examining it, yet set it beside the notebook and made a note. "All right," she said. "Tell me about the pharmacy record." I walked her through it. Zolpidem 10 milligrams, purchased on West Street 6 weeks prior, charged to a Visa registered to Mark Calloway, no corresponding prescription on file. I explained the evidence chain the original bottle retrieved and photographed the swap with the vitamin C bottle, the Ziploc bag currently stored in my wood shop. Patricia asked 3 precise questions about chain of custody. I answered each one. She nodded and wrote. Then she built the strategy. 3 lines, she said, holding up 3 fingers and folding them down one at a time. First, the adultery clause in the prenuptial agreement. That's a clean contractual trigger. No courtroom ambiguity. The clause is bilateral, the documentation is solid, and the conduct is recent. David initiates the filing. The agreement does what it was written to do. David beside me said nothing. He sat straight, a posture I had not seen from him in months, the kind that comes back when a man remembers who he is. Second, Patricia continued. Financial? The compliance tip goes to 3 recipients simultaneously. The compliance division of Cynthia's employer, the Maryland Real Estate Commission, and counsel for the investor Mark has been actively soliciting. She paused. One of those investors, incidentally, has retained an attorney who is a professional acquaintance of mine. That office has already indicated willingness to provide independent documentation of their meetings with Mark. The tip does not submit the recordings as evidence. The cover letter directs auditors to specific account numbers, specific transaction dates, and cross-references the pharmacy record and the permit filing as contextual corroboration. I will include a formal request for confidential preliminary review before any notification is made to the subjects. That is standard procedure for whistleblower format submissions and protects the integrity of the process. Everything the auditors find independently from that point forward is clean evidence gathered through their own institutional authority. She said it without theatrics, the way experienced attorneys deliver the most consequential sentences flatly, completely without decoration. "Sandra," I said. Patricia looked at her notes. "The accounting contact. Yes. Those 3 calls go into a separate annex. I'll cross-reference the account numbers against the commission reporting discrepancy. That's a separate exposure for Cynthia, entirely. Her employer's compliance team will find it before we need to raise it." On a third deed, I said, "Third is elder abuse." Patricia opened a new page in her legal pad. Maryland Criminal Code, Section 3-604, Vulnerable Adult First Degree. The Zolpidem purchase in Mark's name with no prescription is the foundation. The pharmacy trace establishes illegal acquisition. The audio files establish intent, specifically the calls, regarding the memory care facility intake and the capacity determination inquiry. The camera footage from the basement establishes unauthorized entry. Combined, this is not a civil matter. This is a referral to the Anne Arundel County State's Attorney. She set her pen down. David spoke for the first time since we had arrived. "The account transfer cleared this morning," he said. 50% of the joint balance moved to a separate account in my name only. I have the transfer confirmation and all supporting receipts, medical expenses, household costs, everything paid toward Tom's care and maintenance of the property over the past 3 months. Patricia looked at him with an expression that was as close to approval as I suspected she allowed herself professionally. "Your position is clean," she said. "You are the spouse who provided financial support to an elderly parent. That is the precise opposite of someone with fraudulent intent in any Maryland court." David nodded once and said nothing further. Near the end of the meeting, I placed one more document on the desk. Patricia looked at the cover page. Then she read it through all 4 pages slowly, without interruption. When she finished, she set it down with a deliberateness that told me she understood exactly what she was looking at. "When did you execute this?" she asked. 1987, I said. "The year Eleanor and I bought the house. We agreed from the beginning the remainder interest would go to the Maryland Veterans Association. It is a life estate deed, recorded at the Anne Arundel County Courthouse. The SDAT database shows the property under my name because I am the life tenant. The assessment record reflects the taxpayer of record. But the remainder interest transferred to the association on the day we signed. No court can reverse a properly recorded remainder conveyance. The association has held that interest for 37 years. Patricia looked at the document for another moment. Then she looked at David. She checked the SDAT record and found his name. She said, "SDAT displays assessment data. It is not a deed search. To locate the life estate structure and the remainder interest. She would have needed to pull the original instrument from emdlandrick.net or visit the courthouse directly and request the recorded deed. She stopped at SDAT because she found the answer she expected to find." David's jaw tightened slightly. "She told me she had verified the ownership. She said she was satisfied." Patricia placed her hand flat on the document. "Mr. Miller," she said, looking at me, "she has spent months pursuing a property that was legally committed to a third party before she was born. This is the most complete file I have seen in 22 years of practice. We had the legal architecture in place. What we needed was the moment, the single public moment from which retreat was impossible and negotiation was unavoidable." "Let her build the stage," Patricia said. "Then we step onto it." "What kind of stage?" I asked. She smiled in the way of someone who already knows the last move. "She's building it right now. You'll see." I drove home without knowing what she meant. 24 hours later, Cynthia handed me an envelope containing a printed guest list. The moment I read the first name on it, I understood exactly what Patricia had been waiting for. Before I reveal what Tom did that evening, drop the word "ready" in the comments if you've been with this story from the beginning. I want to know how many of you made it this far. A quick note, some elements of this story are fictional, woven in to serve the narrative if that's not what you're here for. This is a perfectly good place to stop and find something that fits you better. No judgment at all. Cynthia had been planning this dinner party for 3 weeks. 12 guests, partners, and business contacts, she told David. She had him polish the silverware twice and order flowers from a shop on Maryland Avenue. What she did not tell him was why she had chosen these 12 people specifically. And what she did not know was that I had recognized 7 of the names the moment I read the list and had already made a few calls of my own. The names were Rogers, Martinez, Coleman, Hartley, Briggs, Dunmore, and Weston. James Rogers had been my executive officer for 4 years aboard the USS Monterey. Luis Martinez had served as chief engineer on 2 deployments. Gregory Coleman now ran the investment division of a private equity firm with offices on Compromise Street 4 blocks from my house. The other 4 were men and women I had worked with at various points across 3 decades. People who knew my name, my record, and exactly what my word was worth in any room they occupied. Mark had been courting all 7 of them as potential investors. He had no idea they already knew the homeowner. Before I went downstairs, I stopped in the bedroom. Eleanor's photograph sat on the nightstand, where it had always been the one taken on the back porch in the summer of 2017, 2 years before she got sick. The light coming through the oak trees the way it does on good July evenings in Annapolis. I stood there for a moment and looked at it. "Eleanor," I said quietly, "this one's for you." Then I fastened the last button on my dress uniform and went to the top of the stairs. Cynthia had the downstairs arranged. Well, I would give her that. The table was set correctly, the lighting was warm, the flowers were good. She had positioned herself near the front door to receive guests, introducing herself as the hostess with the ease of a woman entirely comfortable in that role. David moved between the kitchen and the dining room, carrying things, refilling glasses, not invited to sit. I watched from the upstairs hallway for the first hour and let her have it. Let her believe fully and without interruption that the house was hers, and the evening was hers, and every person in the room was there at her invitation. At 8 o'clock, I walked down the stairs. I had not worn the dress uniform since Eleanor's memorial service. It still fit. The ribbons were in the correct order. The shoulder boards caught the light from the chandelier as I reached the bottom step. And the room went quiet the way rooms do when something shifts in them, that everyone registers before anyone has processed why. Rogers stood up first. "Commander Miller." He said it the way men say a title that means something to them, not as a formality, but as a recognition. Martinez was on his feet a half-second later, then Coleman, then Hartley and Briggs together, then Dunmore, then Weston. 7 people standing in a room Cynthia had spent 3 weeks preparing. I watched Mark in the moment Rogers rose. That was the image I would carry from the evening. Not Cynthia, not the table, not the uniform. Mark's face in the space of less than 2 seconds, as the situation resolved itself into something he had not calculated for. I saw the recognition first, the instant he understood who I was to these people, then the calculation rapid and visible, as he ran the numbers on what that meant for every conversation he had held with each of them. Then the conclusion that there was no remaining move, not one. The expression didn't become panic. It became absence, like a light source switching off cleanly, leaving nothing where there had been something. I had seen that look before, on officers who understood they had lost a position they could not recover. I crossed the room and shook hands with each of my guests by name. Rogers held my hand a beat longer than necessary and said quietly, "Good to see you, Commander. We'll talk before I leave." I thanked him and moved on. Cynthia stood near the kitchen doorway, holding a glass. She was no longer drinking from watching 7 of her 12 invited guests greet the man she had described to at least 2 of them as experiencing memory difficulties. I did not look at her directly. I moved to the head of the table, the seat she had occupied every evening for 2 months, as though it had always been hers, pulled out the chair and sat down. Then I looked across the table at her and smiled. "Thank you for having everyone over, Cynthia," I said. "It's been a long time since this house had guests. Eleanor would have loved it." My voice was completely level. Cynthia looked back at me. It was the first time in 11 weeks that she did not immediately have something to say. David sat to my left. He did not look at the floor. The dinner lasted 2 hours. I did not attack Cynthia once I did not need to. I spoke with my guests about their work, their families, the waterfront development on the Eastport side, the season. I answered questions about the house and its history, with the ease of a man entirely at home in it, because I was. The table talked the way tables do when the right people are in the right room. Mark said very little after the first 30 minutes. He refilled his own glass twice and watched the evening move away from him with the stillness of a man who has stopped trying to redirect a current he cannot fight. Before the last guests left, Rogers drew me aside near the front door. "Commander," he said, "I wasn't aware of the full picture here. I won't be signing anything with her." He paused. "Or with him." I thanked him and said I appreciated him coming. By 10:30, the room had emptied. I noticed Mark's absence before I noticed anything else. He had gone without saying goodbye to Cynthia, without collecting his jacket from the chair where he had left it, without a word to anyone. Just gone. Cynthia stood alone in the kitchen phone in her hand, looking out the window above the sink at the dark backyard. Her face had lost the architecture it usually maintained. The composure was still there in the set of her shoulders, but it had become effortful in a way it had never been before. David stood beside me in the hallway. Neither of us spoke. By Monday morning, 3 of Cynthia's largest pending contracts had been withdrawn, and on that same Monday morning, Patricia's office sent a package, not the recordings, but a formal cover letter with annotated account references directing the compliance division to specific transaction records, accompanied by an official request for confidential preliminary review prior to subject notification. The audit that followed was not conducted by us. It was conducted by them. And 2 days after that, Cynthia made the worst mistake of her life. I have seen many desperate moves in my life, on the water and off it. Desperate people tend to do predictable things. They escalate. They overreach. They make the kind of mistakes that only happen when fear has replaced strategy. In the 48 hours after the dinner party, Cynthia was on the phone constantly. I could hear the tone of it through the ceiling, not the words, just the register of a woman whose calls were not being answered. On the morning of the 3rd day, she stopped calling. That was when I knew the next move was coming. The 48 hours had been quiet in the way that pressure builds quietly. Saturday morning, she had called 7 times. Before noon, I knew, because Bill was monitoring the outgoing call log through a passive intercept he had set up 3 weeks prior. Mark did not answer. Rogers did not answer. The 2 colleagues she had hosted at the dinner party did not answer. By Sunday evening, the calls had become shorter, the gaps between them longer. A woman recalibrating, running the inventory of what she had left and finding it shorter than she had believed. I spent those 2 days in the wood shop, not hiding working. There was a side table I had been building for 3 months, the kind of project that asks for patience rather than skill, and I gave it the attention it deserved. David came out both evenings and sat on the 3-legged stool without saying much. That was fine. Some of the most important conversations between fathers and sons happen in the space between sentences. Sunday night, the calls stopped entirely. Monday morning, I was in the woodshop by 5:30 with coffee watching the early December light come up gray and cold over the back fence. The oak tree at the corner of the yard stood bare now, its branches showing the gray housing of Bill's camera against the pale sky, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, which meant invisible to anyone who didn't already know. Under the eave of the Hendersons' house next door, the second unit was equally still. Walter Henderson had been a merchant marine for 20 years and had needed no explanation when Bill asked for permission to mount a passive housing unit on his property line. He had said yes before Bill finished the sentence. At 7:43, Cynthia came out the back door. She was wearing a dark jacket over her pajamas, which told me the decision had been made quickly, not planned from the night before, but arrived at some time in the early morning hours when the options had finally narrowed to one. She walked to the center of the yard and stood there for a moment. I watched through the woodshop window from behind the workbench far enough back that I was in shadow. She didn't look toward the shop. What she did next, she did efficiently and without hesitation, which told me she had thought it through even if the overall strategy was collapsing. She pulled her sleeve back and drew her forearm twice across the upper rail of the back fence, the weathered section I had been meaning to replace for 2 years. Rough enough to raise a welt without much pressure. Then she straightened, composed herself, and struck her own face twice with an open hand. Not hard enough to leave serious injury, hard enough to leave a mark. No sound came from either camera, no indicator light, no mechanical movement. The oak branch above her held perfectly still in the cold air. She went inside. 60 seconds later, I heard her voice through the kitchen window, elevated and unsteady in the particular way of someone performing distress for a specific audience. She was on the phone with 911. I set down my coffee cup, walked to the woodshop door, and called David's cell. "Come downstairs," I said. "Stay inside. Don't go to the back door." "What's happening?" "Stay inside." The patrol unit arrived in 9 minutes. 2 officers, 1 senior, 1 junior, the senior 1. The same woman who had taken the family dispute report in November. She recognized the address. I could see it in the slight adjustment of her expression as she came up the front walk and found me standing on the porch, coffee in hand, no visible injury, entirely calm. Cynthia was in the living room. She had added tears to the performance by the time the officers came through the door, which was competent work under pressure. The marks on her arm were visible. The redness on her cheek was visible. She pointed at me. I said nothing. I took out my phone and called Bill. He arrived 4 minutes later. He had been parked 2 blocks away, laptop open on the passenger seat, watching the feed in real time. He walked up the front path with the hard drive in his hand and introduced himself to the senior officer with the direct economy of a man who has briefed law enforcement before and knows exactly what they need to hear first. "Officer, I'm a former naval intelligence officer and a licensed private security consultant. I've had surveillance equipment on this property for several weeks following a suspected elder abuse situation. I think you'll want to review this before you take any statements." The senior officer looked at him for a moment, then at me, then back at Bill. She took the drive. They used the junior officer's laptop in the patrol car. It took 4 minutes. The senior officer came back inside with an expression that had changed in a specific way, the careful neutrality of someone who has just seen something that requires a significant revision of the situation in front of them. Cynthia tried the explanation she had used in November. Family concern, memory issues, a misunderstanding that had gotten out of hand. She delivered it with less confidence than she had the first time, which was understandable because the first time there had been no footage. The senior officer listened to the full explanation. Then she said quietly and without particular emphasis, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with us." Cynthia's eyes moved to me. I looked back at her without expression. David stood in the hallway entrance behind me. I heard him take one slow, steady breath. When I glanced back at him, he was looking straight ahead at the door at the officers, at the woman being asked to gather her coat and her identification. He was not looking at the floor. I reached back and put my hand on his shoulder. He didn't move away from it. I didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed to be said. Cynthia was released on her own recognizance that evening. She came back to the house, there was nowhere else to go, and walked past us without a word straight up the stairs and closed the door. She did not come down for dinner. She did not come down at all. 4 days later, after consulting with her attorney, a man named Gerald Marsh, whose name I had not heard before, but whose reputation in property litigation Bill knew well enough to give me a single, meaningful look. When I mentioned it, Cynthia came back downstairs. She was carrying the only weapon she believed she had left. Not her contacts, not her composure, her attorney, and a property claim she had spent 4 days preparing. His name was Gerald Marsh. Young sharp suit the particular confidence of a man who had not yet lost a case, which usually means he had not yet taken on the ones that were genuinely difficult. He sat down across from me in the living room with a leather briefcase and a stack of legal documents, and I recognized the expression immediately. He thought this was going to be straightforward. Patricia was on the laptop screen propped on the side table to my left, her camera on her notepad open, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, the way she wore them when she was paying close attention and wanted both hands free. David sat in the armchair near the window, the one that had been his mother's chair, the one nobody had sat in since Eleanor died, until David had quietly reclaimed it 2 weeks ago. He had told me about the deed the night before. He knew what was in the envelope on the coffee table. He was the only one in the room besides me who did. Gerald opened with the prepared statement, which was professional and well-structured. Cynthia, seated beside him on the sofa, watched him deliver it with the focused attention of someone who had rehearsed this scenario many times over 4 days and needed it to unfold exactly as planned. The claim was constructive ownership, 2 years of continuous residence, documented contributions to household expenses, an argument that Cynthia's financial investment in the property renovations, furnishings maintenance costs had created an equitable interest that the court would recognize. Gerald cited 3 Maryland precedents. He spoke for 11 minutes without interruption. The ask was 40% of the assessed market value, approximately $380,000, based on comparable sales in the historic district. I let him finish completely. I did not shift in my chair. I did not look at Patricia, though I could see in my peripheral vision that she had stopped writing. When Gerald concluded, I said, "Thank you." Then I stood up, walked to the woodshop door at the back of the kitchen, and returned 30 seconds later with a manila envelope. The paper inside was the color of old cream, the particular yellow of documents that have been properly stored for decades rather than left to deteriorate. I set it on the coffee table in front of Gerald and sat back down. "That is a life estate deed," I said. "Signed in 1987, notarized and recorded at the Anne Arundel County Courthouse. Under that instrument, the remainder interest in this property was conveyed to the Maryland Veterans Association at the time of execution. I am the life tenant. The SDAT database lists my name because the assessment and tax records are maintained under the life tenant of record. But the remainder interest has belonged to the association since the day Eleanor and I signed that document. No court can extinguish a properly recorded remainder conveyance. The interest vested in 1987. It has been held continuously for 37 years. Gerald picked up the envelope with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to reviewing documents under pressure. He removed the deed, unfolded it carefully, and began to read. The room was quiet. Outside, a car moved slowly down Randall Street. The December light came through the front windows at the low angle it holds in the middle of the month, cutting across the floor between us. I watched Gerald's face. It was as faces go, a readable one, which surprised me, given his profession. I saw the initial scan, which was confident and rapid, then the second pass, slower, which was where the confidence began to separate from the expression. By the third paragraph, his jaw had made a small, involuntary adjustment. By the fourth, he had set the deed flat on the coffee table and was reading it with both hands pressed lightly on either side. The posture of a man who wants the document to stay exactly where it is while he processes what it contains. Cynthia watched him. "What does it mean?" she asked. Gerald took a moment before he answered. He set the deed down with a deliberateness that I recognized it was the same gesture Patricia used when she wanted to convey that a document had weight. "It means," he said, "that the SDAT search you conducted showed you the assessment record. SDAT is a tax assessment database. It reflects the name of the taxpayer of record in this case, the life tenant. It does not capture deed structure. The life estate and remainder interest exist in the recorded instrument at the courthouse. A standard online property search does not retrieve that document. To find the remainder conveyance, you would have needed to access mdlandrec.net and pull the original recorded deed, or visit the courthouse directly and request it through the land records office." He paused. "This instrument is properly executed, properly notarized, and properly recorded. The remainder interest transferred in 1987. As a matter of Maryland property law, it is not subject to any equitable claim arising from subsequent occupancy or contribution." He looked at Cynthia. "The claim we discussed is not viable, Cynthia." Cynthia looked at me. It was a different look than any she had directed at me in the past 3 months. The architecture of calculation was gone. What remained was something rawer, not grief. Not anger, but the particular expression of a person who has just understood the full distance between where they believed they were standing and where they actually were. I looked back at her without satisfaction. There was none to feel. There was only the long, quiet fact of it. "You searched SDAT and found what you expected to find," I said. "You stopped at the surface because the surface gave you the answer you were looking for. In 30 years of naval intelligence, That was the most common mistake I ever saw, and the most costly. She said nothing. The deed has been at the courthouse since before David was born, I said. It was never hidden. It was simply in the place where recorded documents are kept, waiting for anyone who looked in the right location. Gerald closed his briefcase with a quiet, final click. He stood, extended his hand to me, with the courtesy of a professional who has lost a position cleanly and knows how to leave a room, and said he appreciated my time. I shook his hand. He did not look at Cynthia again before he walked to the front door. A moment later, I heard it close behind him. Cynthia stood in the entrance hall for a long moment without moving. Then she turned and walked to the stairs. I watched her go. The careful, contained movement of someone holding themselves together through the sheer discipline of momentum. David came and stood beside me. After a moment, he put his hand on my shoulder, a gesture that had always moved in the other direction between us for 41 years. "Is it over, Dad?" I looked at the envelope on the coffee table. "Almost," I said. Cynthia was upstairs on the phone for an hour. I could hear the tone of her voice through the ceiling, not the words, only the register. It was unlike anything I had heard from her before. The composure that had been her most consistent instrument was gone. What came through the floorboards was something unguarded and searching. The sound of a person trying to locate a foothold in ground that had entirely shifted. Patricia had told me this moment would come. She had told me exactly what to do when it did. She had been right. What happened in the 2 weeks after Gerald Marsh walked out of my living room moved faster than I had anticipated, even for a man who spent a career managing controlled chaos. Patricia had told me, once the structure fails, it fails completely. She was right, and the key was that we never had to force it. We simply stopped holding it up. The independent audit was not something we conducted. That distinction mattered legally and practically. Patricia's cover letter had directed the compliance division of Cynthia's firm to specific account numbers, specific transaction dates, and specific cross-references. The auditors followed the trail themselves through their own institutional process with their own authority. What they found was exactly what the letter had pointed them toward. They did not need our recordings. They did not need our testimony. The money had moved in patterns that institutional auditors are trained to recognize. And once they began looking in the right places, the documentation assembled itself. The audit closed on a Thursday. Cynthia was called into her firm's offices that same afternoon and did not return. 72 hours later, the Maryland Real Estate Commission suspended her license pending a formal review. The notice cited the audit findings and a secondary referral from one of Mark's investors, a man whose attorney had been in contact with Patricia for 3 weeks and had been waiting for precisely this moment to file. Mark had been making his own calculations. When 3 investors arrived simultaneously with demands for accounting, and when it became apparent that the permit application he had filed with Anne Arundel County submitted 11 days before Cynthia had moved into my house, for a mixed-use commercial conversion at my address for a property in which he held no legal interest whatsoever, had been entered into evidence as documentation of premeditation. His attorney advised cooperation. Mark accepted a plea agreement the following Monday. Investment fraud, 2 counts, 18 months at a federal correctional facility. In exchange, he provided a full statement implicating Cynthia in the coordinated scheme, including the timeline, the financial structure, and the specific conversations in which the property transfer strategy had been discussed. Patricia presented the summary to David and me in her office on a Wednesday morning, the winter light flat and gray through the State Circle windows. "Cynthia is facing 2 charges," she said, in the measured tone she used when precision mattered more than comfort. First, criminal elder abuse under Section 3-604 of the Maryland Criminal Code, specifically the administration of a controlled substance to a vulnerable adult without consent or medical authorization. The pharmacy record establishing Mark's illegal Zolpidem purchased the preserve bottle with documented chain of custody, and the surveillance evidence collectively support that charge. Second, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. The permit application Mark filed before Cynthia moved into this house is the premeditation anchor it establishes that the property transfer was planned before occupancy began, and not a response to circumstances that developed afterward. Mark's cooperation statement connects Cynthia directly to that planning. The audit results confirm the financial mechanism. She set her pen down. Without employment, without a license, without liquid assets, and without a co-conspirator willing to share the exposure, her attorney has recommended a plea. Cynthia accepted the agreement the following Friday. 2 counts both reduced. 18 months, suspended sentence supervised probation, full restitution to David and Tom for documented financial losses, and a voluntary agreement not to seek reinstatement of her real estate license for a period of 5 years. She signed the documents in a courthouse conference room on Duke of Gloucester Street. Patricia told me she had been composed throughout, which did not surprise me. Composure had always been Cynthia's most reliable instrument, even when everything beneath it had given way. That afternoon, David sat in Patricia's office and signed the divorce filing. His handwriting was steady. I watched his hand move across the signature line without hesitation and thought about the man who had arrived at my house in September with slumped shoulders and the look of someone who had forgotten how to take up space. "I should have done this a long time ago," he said. "You're doing it now," I told him. "That's what matters." Patricia witnessed the signature dated the document and said it with the efficiency of someone who has presided over many endings and understands that the most important thing she can do in those moments is handle the paperwork cleanly and let the people in the room have whatever they need to feel. That evening, David and I sat on the front porch. December in Annapolis carries a particular cold, not the brutal cold of the interior states, but the damp, persistent cold that comes off the water and finds the gaps in your jacket. We sat with our coats on and our coffee going warm in our hands and watched the oak trees move in the light wind coming up Randall Street. David hadn't said much since the courthouse. That was fine. There are different kinds of silence between fathers and sons, and this one was not the heavy, compressed kind I had known through the autumn. This was the silence of a man settling into ground that was finally solid again. After a while, he said, "I went to the hardware store this morning, before I came here." I looked at him. "What did you get?" "A toolbox," he said. "A real one." He wasn't looking at me when he said it. He was looking at the oaks at the street, at the cold sky, above the roof line of the houses across the way. But I saw the line of his jaw, and the set of his shoulders, and the way he was sitting in the porch chair, straight easy, taking up exactly the space that belonged to him. I looked back at the street. I did not smile immediately, but somewhere beneath the tiredness of the past 3 months, beneath the long discipline of the planning and the watching and the waiting, I felt something return that I had not realized was gone, something quiet and specific the way certain things come back, not loudly, but with the simple certainty of a fixed point reappearing after a long navigation through fog. There was still one thing left to do. It had nothing to do with law, nothing to do with tactics or evidence or strategy. It was personal, something I had been postponing for months, not because I didn't know how, but because I had needed the fog to clear completely before I went. I needed to be able to look her in the eye and tell her that it was over. She had waited long enough. Eleanor Margaret Miller, born June 14th, 1952, died March 3rd, 2019, beloved wife, devoted mother, and the reason this house was worth fighting for in the first place. I had not visited her grave since the day Cynthia moved in, not because I had forgotten, but because I didn't want to come until I had something worthy to tell her. We went on a Sunday. The last Sunday of December, the kind of day the mid-Atlantic occasionally produces in winter as a kind of apology for everything else. Sky the deep. Clear blue of cold salt water, no wind, the ground hard and quiet under our feet. David drove. He had called the night before and asked if I wanted company, and I had said yes before he finished the question. The United States Naval Academy Cemetery sits on a gentle slope above the Severn, the kind of ground that holds its silence well. Eleanor is buried in the civilian section, which was her preference. She had said more than once that she had spent enough years being a Navy wife, and that she intended to rest somewhere that didn't require a rank to explain. I had always respected that. I respected most things she said, usually more in retrospect, than in the moment which she had also predicted. I had bought white roses from the shop on Maryland Avenue, the same shop Cynthia had used for the dinner party flowers, which was either irony or coincidence. And I had decided on the walk back to the car that it didn't matter which. Eleanor had liked white roses. She said red ones were too urgent, like they were trying to make a point. White ones just were what they were. David and I walked from the gate without speaking. The path was familiar to me, in the way that frequently visited grief becomes familiar, not comfortable, but known. I had been here alone many times in 5 years. This was the first time I had come with my son. Her stone is simple. Name dates, and below them, the line she had chosen herself, years before it became relevant. She kept the light on. I had argued for something more elaborate when we had discussed it in that careful way that couples discuss the undiscussable. She had overruled me without raising her voice. She usually did. I stood in front of the stone and held the roses and did not speak for several minutes. David stood slightly behind me and to the left, giving me the space without being asked, which told me he understood something about grief that I had not taught him directly, which meant Eleanor had. When I spoke quietly, not to David, to her. Eleanor, it's over. The house is safe. The deed held the way you always said it would when I worried about it late at night, and you told me to stop worrying because the paperwork was correct, and correct paperwork does what it's supposed to do. I paused. David is here with me. He's standing very straight. You'd recognize him again. I heard David take a slow breath behind me. I kept the promise, I said. Everything we built is still standing. I set the white roses at the base of the stone and stepped back. David moved up beside me. We stood together for a long moment, the winter sky enormous and blue above the slope, the river visible through the bare trees at the bottom of the hill. Then he turned slightly toward me, and when he spoke, he was not looking at the ground. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry for all of it, for not seeing it sooner, for not protecting you the way you spent your whole life protecting me, for letting someone walk into your house and make you feel like a guest in it." He stopped, and when he continued, his voice was level, not controlled in the effortful way, but genuinely steady, the way a man sounds when he has already made his peace with what he's saying. "I'm sorry, Dad. I had been waiting for this. Not impatiently, not with any expectation, just the way you wait for something you know is coming when the time is right." I looked at my son's face. He wasn't trying to hide what he felt. He was just standing in it the way Eleanor had always stood in things, without apology for the emotion, without the need to make it smaller than it was. "You were inside it, David," I said. "It's hard to see clearly when you're inside the fog." I paused. "The important thing is that I found my way out," he said. "Yes," I said, "you did." We were quiet for another moment. A crow moved through the bare oak branches at the edge of the path, unhurried, and then was gone. "She would have solved all of this in about 3 days," I said. David made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh I had heard from him in months. "She always knew what to do when the house needed protecting." "She was right about everything," I said. "She always was." "She was right about you," David said. "She used to tell me when I was maybe 12, 13, she'd say, 'Your father is the most patient man I have ever met. And the most dangerous thing about him is that nobody believes it until it's too late.'" He paused. I didn't understand what she meant until about 3 months ago. I looked at Eleanor's stone. The afternoon light was moving across it in the way that low winter sun moves across pale surfaces slowly, with a quality of attention. I had come to this place many times in 5 years with nothing but loss. I stood here now with something different, not triumph, because that was not the right word and Eleanor would have corrected me for using it. Something quieter, the specific weight of a kept promise, the feeling of a man who has done what he said he would do and can now finally be still. That evening, I called Bill. Not about strategy, that chapter was closed. We talked the way men talk when the work is finished, and there is nothing left to plan easily and without agenda. At the end of the call, he asked, "Tom, what's next?" I was looking through the kitchen window at the garage at the shape of the unfinished side table visible through the wood shop window in the dark. "I'm going to finish what I started," I said. "The table?" Bill asked. "In the table," I said, "and a few other things." The following Saturday, David appeared at 8 in the morning with his new toolbox. He set it down on the porch steps, looked at me and said, "Dad, show me how to fix the fence." And I understood then that the table had always been waiting for the right moment. And so had we. January arrived quietly. The house on Randall Street was mine again, not just on paper, but in the feeling of it when I walked through the front door each morning. The silence was different now. Not the silence of a place under occupation, the silence of a place at rest. I had forgotten what that felt like. The legal proceedings were winding toward their conclusion in the way of such things slowly, with the particular bureaucratic patience of a system that moves on its own schedule regardless of what any individual party needs. Cynthia was completing the terms of her agreement. Mark was where he was. I had stopped tracking the details beyond what Patricia sent me in her monthly updates, which I read once and filed. That chapter had its own momentum now, and it no longer required my attention. What required my attention was the table. I had been working on it since the first week of January, coming out to the wood shop in the early mornings before the neighborhood woke up, in the particular stillness that settles over Annapolis in winter, when the tourists are gone and the waterfront empties out and the city becomes briefly just a place where people live. I had the rough dimensions established, the joinery planned, the wood selected from the stack I had been seasoning in the corner of the shop for 2 years. Black walnut. Eleanor had always said walnut was the only wood that looked better the older it got. She had said the same thing about certain people. The first Saturday of January, David came by at 8 in the morning. I heard his car on the street before I heard the front door. Then his footsteps through the kitchen. Then the pause at the woodshop entrance. I was running the hand plane across the face of the main board, taking long strokes with the grain, and I did not look up. "You planning to stand there all morning?" I said, "or are you going to come in and help?" Oh, he came in. He sat down on the 3-legged stool, his stool now, claimed by repetition, and looked at the wood on the workbench with the focused attention of a man who is genuinely trying to understand something rather than simply appear interested. I handed him a sheet of sandpaper 80 grit and pointed at the secondary board propped against the wall. "And start with the grain," I said. "Never against it." He took the paper and began. Wrong direction. I reached over and corrected his hand without comment, repositioning his wrist, so the stroke ran parallel to the fiber rather than across it. He tried again, this time right. The sound changed from a scratching resistance to a smooth, continuous draw, the sound of the paper and the wood agreeing with each other. We worked like that for a while. The wood shop was warm from the small electric heater in the corner, and outside the window, the snow that had started overnight was still coming down in the light. Unhurried way of January snow that is not in a hurry to arrive anywhere. The street was white and quiet. A cardinal sat in the oak for a while and then didn't. I taught the way my own father had taught me, not as a commander issuing corrections, but as a man passing something forward through his hands. My father had built furniture in a garage in Towson for 30 years, had taught me the difference between cutting with the grain and against it before I was old enough to understand why it mattered. I understood later. Most important things I had found revealed their meaning after the fact. David worked steadily. He was not naturally gifted at this. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 20 years at a desk, precise in a different way, trained for keyboards and conference tables rather than planes and chisels. But he was patient with his own mistakes, which mattered more than aptitude. He did not rush the strokes. When something didn't work, he stopped and tried to understand why before he tried again. Near the end of the morning, he stood back and looked at the board he had been working on. The surface smooth now in the patches he had finished. The wood beginning to show the figure in the grain that walnut keeps hidden until the surface opens up. "Dad," he said, "what are we building?" "A dining table," I said, "for this house." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The old one did, Cynthia." "The old one is fine," I said. "But every house needs a table built by the people who live in it. Your grandfather built the first one. I built the second one with your mother. This one is ours." David looked down at the board in his hands. He didn't say anything. He ran his thumb along the edge. He had been working a checking gesture, reading the surface by, feel the way woodworkers do, a habit that takes years to develop, and that he was already, without knowing it, beginning to acquire. Then he picked up the sandpaper and continued. I watched him work. The morning light through the window was the flat, clean white of winter, and in it I could see the steadiness that had come back to him in his shoulders, in the way he stood at the bench, in the unhurried attention he gave to the board in front of him. He was not performing competence. He was simply working, which is different and better. I thought about what I had been looking for through the long months of the autumn, through the watching and the planning and the long nights with headphones and notebooks and the careful architecture of a trap built from patience and recorded time. I had told myself it was about the house. Then I had told myself it was about justice, about the law, about protecting what Eleanor and I had built over 4 decades on Randall Street. All of that had been true. None of it had been the whole truth. The whole truth was this: my son standing at a workbench in January, light learning to read the grain of a piece of walnut with his hands, building something that would outlast both of us if we built it right. That was what I had been fighting for. Not a verdict, not a deed. This. We worked on the table every weekend through January and into February side by side, in the easy silence of people who no longer need to fill the space between them with words. There were things said and things not said, the slow, patient work of rebuilding something that had been damaged for a long time. Not the house, something else entirely. And on a Saturday morning at the end of February, David arrived and said 4 words I had not heard from him in years. February 22nd, 2025, a Saturday. David showed up at 8 in the morning with his toolbox tucked under his arm. He set it down on the front porch steps, looked at the fence along the front yard, the section that had been leaning since October, one post shifted by the frost heave of an early freeze, and said 4 words: "Dad, show me how." Not "can you fix it?" Not "it needs fixing." Show me how. Those 4 words were worth more than any court verdict. The morning carried the particular quality that February occasionally produces along the Chesapeake as a preview of what is coming, not warm exactly, but no longer cold in the way that settles into your bones. The oak trees on Randall Street were still bare, but the light had changed overnight. Spring was not here yet, but it had sent word ahead. I got my coffee and my work jacket and came back out to the porch. "As first things," I said, "look at the post. Tell me what you see." David crouched down and examined the base of the leaning post, running his hand along the wood, pressing on it to feel how much give there was. Then he stood. "The base is rotted. The post isn't broken. It's just lost its footing." "That's right," I said. "What do you do with something that's lost its footing?" He looked at me steadily. "You don't replace the whole thing. You reset the base." "Correct." We worked through the morning at David's natural pace, methodical, unhurried, honest about uncertainty. When he wasn't sure of something, he asked. When he made a mistake, he stopped and looked at it before trying again. I showed him how to pull the post without disturbing the adjacent boards, how to clear the rotted wood at the base, how to pack fresh gravel for drainage before setting the new post, how to use the level not to chase perfection, but to confirm what your hands were already telling you. Bill arrived at 10. He came on foot from the next block, hands in his coat pockets, and stood on the sidewalk watching us for a moment before saying anything. David didn't look up from the post he was tamping into position. After a while, Bill said, "Most people hire someone for that." David, without turning, "Most people aren't learning how to do it right." Bill looked at me. I said nothing. He shook his head slowly, and the smile that crossed his face was the quiet kind, not the tactical smile of a man who has won something, but the simpler expression of a man who has just seen something he had been waiting a long time to see. By 11, the fence was done. David stepped back and looked at it straight true, the new post aligned with the line of the old ones, the whole section solid in a way it had not been for months. He turned to me. "Did I do it right?" I looked at the fence, then at my son, the set of his shoulders, the calluses forming on his right thumb from 2 months of sandpaper and plane work, the direct way he was meeting my eyes. "You did it right," I said. Bill stepped forward beside me. "Mission complete, Commander." I looked at the house, the familiar red brick, the white porch trim. Eleanor's rose bushes along the foundation, dormant still, but there, faithful as they had always been through every difficult season. The brass knocker on the front door that David had polished with his mother when he was 7 years old. "Not yet," I said. "Almost." I opened the front door. "David, come inside. There's something I want you to see." The woodshop held the long, clean light of late February coming through the east window. In the center of the room stood the table 2 months of Saturday mornings made solid. Black walnut, finished with 3 coats of tung oil, the surface dark and deep. The grain moving in patterns you could look at for a long time without seeing the same thing twice. David stood in the doorway and looked at it without speaking. I waited. "Dad," he said, "it's beautiful." I came and stood beside him. "Your grandfather built the first table in this house. I built the second one with your mother the summer before you started school. She picked the wood. I cut the joints. She sanded everything twice and told me I hadn't done it right the first time." I paused. She was correct. This one is ours. David walked to the table and placed both hands flat on the surface, feeling the grain. His own hands had smoothed over weeks of work, reading it with his palms, the way I had taught him. He stood like that for a moment. Then he lifted his head. "Dad, I want to bring it inside, into the dining room." "That's exactly where it belongs," I said. We carried it together through the woodshop door, across the kitchen into the dining room, where the winter light fell across the floor in wide, pale rectangles. We set it in the center of the room, in the position where its predecessors had stood, where this family had eaten and argued and celebrated and sat in silence through the particular weather of decades. It fit the space exactly, which was not an accident. Bill stood in the doorway. When we straightened and stepped back, he looked at me across the length of the room. I nodded. He smiled. "Mission complete, Commander." This time I nodded back. "Mission complete." That evening I sat alone at the new table for a long while after David had gone home. I ran my hand along the surface all those hours of work, all those weekend mornings, all the things said and unsaid in a cold garage through a hard winter. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about 30 years before any of this had happened. And I thought about what my father had said to me on the day I left for the Navy, standing on the porch of the house in Towson, watching me load my single duffel bag, with the stillness of a man who has more to say than time allows. "Tom," he had said, "the real mission was never about the objective. It was about who you become on the way there." I understand now, Dad. I finally do. I didn't tell this story to prove I won. I told it because every family story carries a lesson, and mine arrived later than it should have. I spent 6 months focused on evidence strategy and every calculated move. What I almost missed was simpler David needed his father before he needed a plan. If you see yourself anywhere in this family story, don't wait the way I waited. Talk to the people you love before silence becomes a distance too wide to cross. Family betrayal never arrives from strangers. It sits at your dinner table, speaks in a familiar voice, and moves slowly enough that you almost don't notice until something essential is already gone. That is the hardest truth I took from all of it. I'll tell you what, I believe God does not let the things built with genuine love be destroyed without also leaving a way to rebuild them. The walnut table sitting in my dining room right now is proof of that. Every family story will be tested at some point. Family betrayal can come from the direction you least expect, but it is not the end unless you decide it is. And some things, when rebuilt carefully and with honest hands, come back stronger than before. Family betrayal changes you. What you do with that change is entirely yours to decide. I am not a perfect father, I was not a perfect husband, but I showed up, I paid attention, and I did not quit. If I could leave you with one thing, the people worth fighting for are almost always closer than the enemy you're watching. If this story reached something in you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for staying with Tom Miller until the very last line. A note going forward, upcoming stories may contain fictional elements crafted purely for educational and storytelling purposes. If that's not the content for you, no judgment at all. Choose what serves you best.